The tourists observed with fascination as their companion sat comfortably in a sleigh pulled by two massive deer. The creatures were impatiently pawing through the snow with their antlered heads, eager to move. It appeared as if they were moments away from taking off without their rider, as they pulled against the traces with their powerful bodies. Only the shouted commands of the shaman, muffled by animal skins and hidden behind a cedar mask, restrained them. Finally, Petya Vasilyev settled into position behind the shaman, and the sleigh began to glide forward, leaving a trail of glittering snow in its wake. Zhenya Ivanova and Anton Erimin approached the elderly man, the park's ethnographer, who watched them with amusement. They inquired about when Petya would return. Anton, with a broad smile, inquired of the man, "When might we anticipate the return of our friend? Will there be sufficient time for us to partake of a meal without them?" "The park is not yet open, and there is no place nearby where we can eat," the attendant responded, after a brief moment of reflection. "Go home now, and I will inform you when they will be back." Zhenya exchanged a glance with Anton, worry flashing in her gaze. Anton said with patience, "We have provisions from our camping excursion, so we will not starve. However, kindly inform us if they will return soon. We will not depart without our friend." The elderly man sighed and stated, "If the seer claims someone, it is forever." "Anton!" Zhenya exclaimed in alarm, pulling insistently at his sleeve. "Something is amiss here." Erimin exclaimed, suddenly overcome with anger. He had encountered this situation more than once when he was unable to comprehend something. "I have been fraying my nerves throughout this journey. Therefore, at the very least, calm yourself."
Despite his outward demeanor of bravery, Erimin himself was gripped by an inexplicable apprehension. For the first time since they had accidentally stumbled upon a cluster of low buildings in the snowy taiga, having become slightly lost on the way back from the Laughing Mountain Ridge, Zhenya started to express her reluctance to continue their journey towards the Horin Pavil settlement. She described it as a marshy village situated in the midst of an ancient cedar forest, with no way of knowing what kind of individuals inhabited it. Undeterred by her concerns, the boys proceeded to the village, only to discover that it was an ethnographic park. Along the way, Peter recounted to his companions that he had heard of a park that had been constructed in the distant past, in the year 1950, on the site once occupied by a Mansi settlement. This park was designed under the guidance of a renowned ethnographer named Alexander Bakhtiarov, with the intention of drawing attention to the indigenous peoples of the Urals region. The park's opening date was originally scheduled for March, but by then, everything was already prepared for visitors. Within the park, yurts, heated by chuval fires, housed exhibits showcasing the everyday objects used by the forest dwellers. These included examples of clothing, tribal symbols, and figurines representing birds as symbols of spirituality. At the heart of the park stood a large structure erected on two vertical posts. In the open-air museum, our friends encountered the caretaker. He was perpetually puffing on a bison horn pipe in which something resembling Yaga was slowly smoldering. Despite their initial wariness, the caretaker guided the friends correctly and permitted them to explore the park without venturing into the buildings. As they explored, the caretaker sat on a bench beside his house, observing the occasional visitors.
At this point, they became enthralled by a bag that brought back vivid memories of a witch's cottage from childhood fairy tales. At the end of the cleared, snowy path cutting through the park, they spotted a sleigh. In the sleigh,
sat a figure draped in furs, with a cedar mask concealing their face. The tourists from Isetsk, mesmerized by the spectacle, watched in awe as an enigmatic figure swiftly approached them. With astonishing skill, the stranger harnessed two powerful and ferocious reindeer, their strength straining against the seemingly incongruous harness on their broad backs. Zhenya, more alarmed than ever, turned to the elderly Mansi watchman, seeking an explanation for this peculiar individual who moved with an unsettling grace characteristic of those accustomed to the wilderness. However, the watchman paid no heed to her inquiry, his gaze fixed warily on the approaching figure. As the long, narrow sledge drew near, its runners resembling the tusks of a prehistoric creature, the group was struck with astonishment and Zhenya with fear. The mysterious individual rose slowly from his seat, releasing the reins, and pointed a hooked finger first at Petya and then to a spot behind him. Perplexed, Vasiliev queried, "What is the meaning of this?" Exchanging a bewildered glance with Anton, he sought an answer. Keyur, his eyes gleaming malevolently from beneath the cedar mask, which resembled the visage of a pagan deity, repeated the action, simultaneously uttering a hoarse cry in an unknown tongue that sent the ravens flying with a clamor from the rooftop where they had perched to observe the scene below. Anton addressed the watchman. "Ah, this must be your associate. He saw us arrive and chose to hitch a ride on our sleigh for extra income. What will the cost of this pleasure be to us?" The watchman hesitated, switching between addressing Petya in the unknown language used by the individual who had arrived on the sleigh and in Russian. He continued to gaze at Petya expectantly. "The shaman will not take payment from you." The remainder of the sentence was delivered so softly that even Zhenya, who was intently listening to the exchange, could not clearly hear it. "I think I'll go for a ride," exclaimed Vasiliev eagerly, handing his backpack to Anton. "It will take us about 40 minutes to reach the bus stop near Limanovka, and our bus will not arrive for at least another 3 hours. When will we get another chance like this? And it's free!" With that, he disregarded Zhenya's objections and climbed into the sleigh. Perplexed, the friends watched the sleigh disappear more swiftly than the snow had settled, uncertain what to do, pursue it, or wait for their friend at their spot. "Let's put aside the joking," said Araman, irritably, continuing his inquiry, ignoring Zhenya, who was either hurrying to chase the sleigh or running for help along the highway. "How long will this journey take?" The observer merely smiled sorrowfully. Anton, gritting his teeth with barely controlled anger, not so much at the absurdity of the situation as at his friend's response, said, "Very well. Then tell me, where has our friend gone?" The watchman narrowed his eyes and meditatively chewed on the stem of his self-made pipe, as if deliberating whether to respond to the question or not. Finally, he articulated a response that only served to further perplex his audience. "The seer has brought Vanyuhum to where Mir Susnehuma's Shigir resides," he said. "They will be reading the future together. While there are few left who require such knowledge, those who remain alive are often deluding themselves with intoxication, making it unlikely they would wish to hear divine designs," he concluded with a touch of grumpiness. Anton took 2 long strides, instantly coming to stand beside the elderly man. He seized the collar of the watchman's shirt and gave it a vigorous shake, bringing his powerful fist close to the man's face. "Speak up, old man. Where did Petka's scarecrow find its luck?" The guard cowered in terror and stammered out a hasty reply. "They headed to Viper Fog. It's a few kilometers from here. Take a right at the fork when you pass the dugout on the clearing." Anton dismissed the man with a shake of his head. "If anything befalls our friend, this is your doing. I have no part in it."
As the boys departed, the guard muttered under his breath, "I did not choose him as my target. I had no choice." Anton and Zhenya sprinted along the forest path at full tilt, leaving their rucksacks with equipment and provisions behind on the verge of the path near the exit from the park. Their faces were etched with determination, flushed by the brisk wind and chill. Even Anton, who had previously dismissed Zhenya's concerns with a measure of disdain, began to involuntarily ponder that some malevolent force might lurk behind this seemingly innocuous excursion. Had he not been personally involved in the proceedings, he would likely have derided these impressionable individuals for their alarm after hearing a tale from a well-known acquaintance about a somewhat eccentric caretaker. However, in the somber snow-laden taiga, where the sprawling boughs of evergreen conifers occasionally obscured the sunlight to such an extent that it appeared as if the sun itself might submerge beneath the horizon even in broad daylight, all seemingly inexplicable occurrences took on an ominous tinge. After a brisk run in the frosty air, leaving them panting for breath, the companions spied a weathered wooden placard affixed to a gnarled birch. The inscription on the shield proclaimed "The Bear's Lodge," presumably denoting a clearing nestled amidst a verdant expanse of pine trees. Amidst this clearing, partially obscured by a blanket of snow, lay a partially excavated dugout, the only indication of human habitation. A meager trail, indistinctly discernible through the snowdrifts, led towards a crude hovel fashioned from a hump.
Anton, halting, gestured towards the hovel with a nod. "Shall we venture inside and inquire about the sleigh? Otherwise, the elderly proprietor might have deceived us, leading us astray. With any luck, we may find assistance." The companions hastened along the pathway, navigating the snowdrifts with ease. Scattered here and there were low young fir trees, their branches laden with snow, as if they had strayed from the forest's embrace. Upon reaching the dilapidated door, Anton knocked impatiently, discerning the faint glow of a kerosene lantern through the cracks in the boards. Without waiting for a reply, he pushed open the unbolted door, revealing a windowless chamber devoid of furnishings save for a wooden dais. A figure lay motionless upon it, bathed in the flickering light of a lamp positioned at its head. "My apologies for our abrupt entry," Anton commenced. "I fear it may be a cadaver," Zhenya interjected, her voice quivering with suppressed sobs. Anton immediately realized that his initial assessment was correct upon closer inspection. There was a discernible gap between the torso and head, left by the blade of the heavy weapon, and one leg lay on the floor, resembling an additional component that had been added following the mechanic's disassembly and reassembly of the mechanism. The wounds, however, were peculiar. They appeared unusually smooth, devoid of the characteristic nicks or protruding bone fragments. Instead, they resembled cuts on a tree trunk inflicted by a sharp axe. Anton's mind raced as he attempted to make sense of the situation. Before he could reach any conclusions, a sudden crash reverberated behind him, accompanied by a hissing sound as the light extinguished. Springing to their feet, the companions swiftly turned around, experiencing a surge of relief. The commotion emanated from the door, which shook with increasing vigor from the force of the wind, disregarding the groans of unlubricated hinges. "Let us depart from this place," Zhenya declared resolutely. Anton gazed at her, marveling at the transformation in her appearance. The softness of her features had hardened, imbuing her with a resolute demeanor, and her hands had clenched into tight fists. Had he not known Zhenya so well, he might have mistaken her for someone else. As if driven by fear and anxiety,
Her mind had not crumbled into senseless panic, but rather snapped into action, displaying its strength and capacity to confront adversity. "Let's return to the path and request assistance from someone to contact the police," she declared decisively, cutting off his protests with a dismissive wave of her hand. "It is futile to approach the guard, for there is minimal phone coverage in this park. Moreover, neither of us stands a chance of rescuing Petka alone. We may even encounter the perpetrators," she concluded ruthlessly. Anton's resistance faded at the sight of Zhenya's newfound resolve. Despite the opposition of the wind, which sought to leave the men alone with the deceased, Anton succeeded in opening the door. He held it open so that Zhenya might precede him, and then he followed her outside. Outside, a blizzard raged, a tempest that could not fully unleash its fury among the closely packed trees. So instead, it chose to vent its wrath on the open space by conjuring a snow maelstrom on this forest glade, myriads of snowflakes which grudgingly allowed sunlight to pierce through. In this bleak, whiter-than-white expanse, where the snowdrifts appeared to shift their form with every passing moment, Anton experienced a sense of spatial distortion. He felt as if they had not advanced beyond the initial 300 meters on the increasingly elusive path towards the road, despite taking each step. But, as he glanced behind, he discerned the dark outline of their dugout hut, suggesting that they had actually made only a few paces in their journey.
Anton was on the verge of voicing his concern that they were heading in the wrong direction, when a sudden pain erupted in his tongue and palate from the icy needles that pierced him as he attempted to speak. Suspecting that their progress through the clearing was futile and time was of the essence, Anton halted near one of the few spruces tall enough for him to reach its top. He placed his mitten atop the tree, and in a matter of seconds, Zhenya had vanished behind the curtain of frantically whirling ice needles. Ignoring the flurries of snow that peppered his face, Anton hurried forward in pursuit, determined to catch up as swiftly as possible. After what seemed an eternity, during which the light appeared to dim further, Anton spied Zhenya's warmly clad back. "Do not venture forth alone," Anton exclaimed, placing his hand on Zhenya's shoulder. "Turn around." The young woman nodded feebly, disregarding her companion, who was visibly apprehensive about venturing forth into the frigid tempest alone. Zhenya, undaunted, proceeded resolutely forward, unafraid of the blizzard's onslaught as she had been before. Anton trailed behind, clutching Zhenya's arm with one hand while the other remained deep within his pocket. Somehow, his arm seemed unnaturally stiff, like it had been rendered wooden, and he struggled to shake off the sensation. He realized they should at least have sought shelter, if not in the shelter of a building, then in the protection of the trees where the wind's force was lessened. Yet it felt as if they were trapped in a nightmare, where no matter how far they fled from danger, it pursued them relentlessly. At last, Anton, on the verge of panic, chanced upon a solace in the form of a squat Christmas tree to his left, upon which his glove was perched. The dawning realization that a shelter must lie nearby, where they could weather the storm, despite the presence of the deceased, forestalled his descent into a paroxysm of dread at the prospect of having somehow completed a circuit while striving forward. "Halt!" he croaked to his spouse, giving her arm a firm tug to ensure comprehension. "Let us take refuge within that edifice. We are circling." The young lady abruptly halted and slowly turned towards Anton. Instead of the familiar, lovely face he had expected to see, he beheld a wooden mask sculpted upon a doll clad in feminine attire. Astonished, Anton instinctively pushed aside what he believed to be Yenya and fled screaming, unable to comprehend his own actions. The eerie howl of the wind grew louder, tinged with hysteria. The snowfall, which had begun to diminish when Anton first glimpsed his glove, now resumed with a renewed vigor, as if fresh ammunition had been loaded into the clouds. Completely disoriented, Yeremin raced through a world of white and fury, growing more fatigued and chilled by the moment. Finally, as he teetered on the brink of collapse from exhaustion and despondency, a brilliant light flashed nearby, followed by a powerful impact that plunged him into darkness. Semyon Nelyubin, driving on his shift, occasionally jolted over potholes, which had begun to emerge from under the melting winter snow in the unusually warm March sunshine. The taiga, full of forests, flashed by the windows with heavy hills and bumps floating by. Rivulets of melting water were already streaming down the slopes, and shaded lowlands were gradually emerging from hidden places where snow would remain until the end of May, despite the sun's decision to display its strength that year. The landscapes were painfully familiar to Semyon, even though he had forgotten what fresh air felt like, without the acrid scent of chemical plant emissions assaulting his nostrils as he drove to his Natsk, to the delight of those ever-hungry people who paid no attention to the desolation left behind by progress. He still recalled how it felt in his youth, when his heart swelled with joy as he meandered through the sunlit expanse of the forest.
When was the park scheduled to open? Semyon inquired of the man in his late 50s who was seated across from him. His expression dour at his attire, consisting of a gray windbreaker beneath which a red plaid cowboy shirt could be discerned. The man, Alexander Bakhtiarov, turned away from Semyon, gazing out the window, and replied, "It was supposed to have opened 2 weeks ago, on March 3rd, but now we're not even sure if it will ever open," he said softly, as if speaking to himself. Suddenly, the bus came to a halt near a wooden pole bearing a sign indicating that it was 3 kilometers to Khoryin Pavel. Further down the road, a battered yellow police car was parked on the side of the road. A tall, lean police officer emerged from the car, addressing Semyon with a commanding tone. "Lieutenant Hudyakov, I've been dispatched to provide all necessary assistance from the district office along with Ensign Debenko," Hudyakov said, gesturing to his colleague seated behind the wheel. "At ease, Hudyakov," said Semyon, as he patted the police officer on the shoulder. "Where did the victim sustain the injury, you say?" The police officer gestured to a stretch of road near his patrol car. "Right here. Of course, we weren't expecting the committee to take such an interest in this matter, so we haven't done anything like cordoning off the area or anything else yet." Semyon mused. "You call this a simple case. One person went missing after being abducted by an unidentified shaman, while the other person was struck by a vehicle while falling from the woods onto the road and died of shock and fear. No, there's more to this than meets the eye." Hudyakov gave a nonchalant shrug. "As you say. Where would you like to begin?" Semyon scrutinized the police officer. During his tenure as an investigator with the KGB, he encountered numerous law enforcement officials who were either unfit for the job due to inherent incapacity or simply unwilling to delve deeply into the intricacies of a case. Such individuals, as a general rule, brought only harm to investigations and were ill-suited for cases beyond drunken brawls between friends, let alone in the Taiga, where an unknown figure surrounded by centuries-old trees appeared mysterious and unreachable.
How does your vehicle cope with rough terrain? Semyon inquired, gesturing towards the Moskvich before him. Aren't you concerned about becoming stranded in the wilderness? Khudjakov spread his hands in apology. I am sorry, there is no alternative. The snow has not fully melted yet, making it manageable, and during the summer we can use the logger's services if necessary. I comprehend your predicament. Allow me to offer a piece of advice. Before the journey becomes too arduous, and the day threatens to become as sultry as if March were attempting to impersonate May, embark upon your vehicle and proceed to your regional hub. Semyon interjected. I do not require your assistance. I have meticulously perused the case file, which suffices. With that, he turned his back on Khudjakov, who stood blinking in confusion, and walked towards Bakhtiarov, who was observing the exchange. The committee member then began. As I understand it, an acquaintance of the victims claimed to have identified a building near the park where the man was dismembered. If my understanding is correct, this building is situated within the park grounds and serves as part of an exhibition. Would you kindly guide me to this peculiar location, which according to reports, terrified young adults to death?
Bakhtiarov affirmed. Indeed, yes. In fact, Tarma resides there. For the Mansi, it serves as a repository for the souls of the departed. Someone, likely one of the inhabitants of Limanovka who were dissatisfied with the establishment of the park, sought to play a prank on me, or perhaps engage in a jest, depending on one's perspective, by vandalizing the exhibit and staining it crimson. Indeed, this act of vandalism caused considerable alarm among the younger visitors. Naturally, I have replaced the door, and now, to prevent such occurrences, the door to the pavilion remains permanently secured. Only I and my guide possess the key. Resuming their journey on the bus, the group traveled approximately 2 kilometers until a slight opening in the forest revealed a clearing with a humble dwelling. Upon exiting the temporary accommodation, Semyon trailed the scientist as they resolutely proceeded along the wooden platform, ultimately reaching the dugout. Despite the swiftness of their pace, Semyon could not help but notice the transformations in the landscape that had taken place since he was captured by the forensic anthropologist's camera 3.5 weeks ago. Were it not for his certainty that he remained in the same location, he would not have recognized it. The snowdrifts had vanished, replaced by mounds of loose snow, from which, in some areas, withered plants still struggled to grow. Not grass, but low fir trees that previously resembled gravestones wrapped in white linen, now emerged from their shrouds and stretched their branches laden with needles exposed to the sunlight. As Semyon trailed Bakhtiarov's footsteps, his mind raced with the intricate details surrounding the enigmatic disappearance of one tourist and the tragic mishap involving another. From the dossier Major Kurikov had entrusted to him, Semyon unearthed the truth about Zhenya Ivanova's ordeal in the midst of a fierce snowstorm. She believed she was being pursued by a mysterious figure, initially mistaking it for her friend Yeremin. However, it turned out to be Stepan Krivoshein, who was on his way from Limanovka to Isetsk. When she tried to hail him for help, he did not stop, instead unleashing a torrent of angry curses. In a fit of rage, Krivoshein emerged from the vehicle, seemingly intent on confronting the girl. But upon seeing her plight, his demeanor softened, leading him to offer her a lift to the nearest place where he could summon assistance from the authorities.
Upon entering the vehicle, Zhenya became aware of the source of the driver's heightened anxiety. In the back seat, there lay an individual she had unintentionally struck on her way from the countryside, unconscious. Imagine her astonishment when she recognized the man as Anton Yerenin, who had been standing beside her without uttering a word, even attempting to depart when Krivoshein brought the car to a halt. Preoccupied with his own predicament, the driver paid scant heed to Zhenya's disjointed ramblings,
assuming she was simply shaken after the incident. This perspective was shared by the officer who questioned her as a witness, emphasizing in his report that she required appropriate medical attention. Once again, the investigation reached a stalemate, which was not particularly distressing. It was about to be written off as another unsolvable case. The watchman at Horen Pavil had categorically denied knowing the shaman, and poor Yereman remained in a coma without any hope of recovery. However, all the files were suddenly requested by a committee that had taken the lead in the investigation, leaving Semyon to wonder what was so significant about the case to warrant their attention. Had the police become so inept that they could only solve cases where the perpetrator turned themselves in? Major Kurakov merely smiled and brushed away a non-existent piece of lint from his shoulder, hinting at something more than just the incident that had befallen those people. Nilubin, too, was intrigued, sensing a deeper mystery at play. The very artifact the Unearthed had once sought after had vanished, Semyon mused, only to be interrupted by Bakhtiarov's outburst. "My goodness, it took us quite a while to get here. Did it not feel like it to you?"
In response, Nelyubin, now realizing that he had forgotten so many things in the few minutes since they left the road and headed for the dugout, muttered something unintelligible. He had tried to avoid thinking about the artifact, but Bakhtiarov's words had brought it back to his mind. As Nelyubin explained, such occurrences sometimes happen here. It appears as if there is nothing beneath one's feet, yet it feels as if one has been walking for an eternity. Perhaps it has something to do with the local magnetic fields or atmospheric emissions. "Here is where Tanwarp Equa would have taken a look," added Semyon. Bakhtiarov paused as he reached for the door handle in front of Semyon. "I see that you are well informed about local mythology," he said, regarding Semyon with renewed respect. Semyon silently thought to himself, "They wouldn't have sent me here otherwise." Semyon stepped into an unconventional exhibition hall, the appearance and interior decor of which defied belief that it had been recently constructed for educational purposes. The adequate lighting provided by 4 kerosene lanterns, lit by a member of the committee following a scientist, and the informative placard next to the display failed to quell the shiver Semyon experienced upon seeing a wooden doll resting on a pedestal. Its appearance was uncanny, with no missing limbs and covered in paint. After that incident, we added lighting and installed an information stand prominently, Bakhtiarov said, tapping the placard. Although, admittedly, I was not in favor of it. In my opinion, it disrupts the ambiance. "And where did you obtain this itarma?" Semyon inquired, attempting to suppress his dismay. Bakhtiarov swiftly responded, "We crafted it ourselves." Semyon approached Bakhtiarov and asked, "Do you know why it appears so unsettling, even to someone accustomed to such objects in your line of research?"
"Yes, because it possesses a soul," replied Bakhtiarov. "Prick the wooden chest with a pointed object, and you'll see a red liquid oozing from it. I'm certain that the person who vandalized it last time did not have red paint on their hands. And even if they did, it was not necessary. There was no point in using it. They likely felt as terrified as the tourists when they witnessed the blood seeping from the doll. Thus, you can rest assured that they achieved their goal." Bakhtiarov remained silent, at a loss for words. "As for you," Semyon said with a sigh, "I can only caution you against touching objects associated with burial rituals. While it's admirable to appreciate the intricacies of small cultures, continuing to explore burial sites will inevitably lead to more than just missing tourists." He exited the pavilion, and Bakhtiarov, feeling a pang of shame, followed him outside. He locked the door and carefully tested its durability by repeatedly pulling on the handle. Desiring to converse with another eyewitness who obstinately denied any complicity in the incident, Simeon requested Bakhtiyarov's assistance in escorting him to the caretaker's dwelling. The residence was not distant from Khorin Pavyl, so they opted to walk rather than taking a bus. "Where did you conceal the missing deity?" Simeon inquired, addressing Bakhtiyarov. The scholar endeavored to avoid making eye contact with the committee member. "On Viper Mist Lake, some kilometers from the park," he responded sullenly. "But, as you are aware, it is now missing." "Perhaps another joke from the locals?" Simeon posited. "I do not think so," said Bakhtiyarov, a wry smile playing on his lips. "They may be capable of malice, yes, but only in minor matters where they need not expend much effort. The idol, however, is not merely to be attained. It must also be extracted from the ground into which our men have dug a good half-meter. Moreover, the locals are wary of it. As soon as we pass Limanovka with the artifact protruding from the back of our truck, all of the inhabitants of the village retreat into their homes."
The existence of this petition became known due to the assistance provided by the Soviet Counterintelligence Service in 1943 when they captured the Unearthed research group, which was abandoned by the German command deep behind enemy lines, and had become interested in an artifact that had since vanished without a trace. Nevertheless, there was something that caused Major Kurikov to question his decision to assign Nilyubin to investigate this mysterious case: Semyon's growing doubts about his experience in the Taiga. Semyon began to recall less and less about his time in the wilderness, which at times seemed vivid, but also felt like a dream. The city with its smog-filled air seemed to bring oblivion, convincing him that there was nothing worth remembering beyond its smelly concrete walls. Upon returning to his hometown, however, the fog cleared, revealing a forgotten life experience. Bakhtiarov noticed Semyon's transformation and asked how he learned about Itarma. Semyon paused for a moment in silence, uncertain whether it was fitting to impart a fragment of his personal narrative to a stranger. Following a brief interval of introspection, during which his interlocutor had already resigned to the lack of response, Semyon resolved that it might be worthwhile. Indeed, Bakhtiarov appeared genuinely intrigued by the culture of the Mansi people, and Semyon's tale could potentially enrich Bakhtiarov's understanding, a gift Semyon was pleased to bestow. "I once resided in those regions," the committee member commenced, capturing Bakhtiarov's astonished gaze. "And I was acquainted with the hunter who crafted itars for the deceased. This skill in itself was not particularly extraordinary, for almost everyone in my village possessed the ability to fashion a container for the spirit from a piece of wood. However, it was Nero who imbued his dolls with a terrifyingly lifelike appearance. Semyon did not disclose that within the hollowed wooden forms crafted by Nero, there existed channels filled with water and lingonberry sap, which the hunter vehemently denied, claiming they were real blood, resulting from the merging of the soul with the meticulously crafted vessel. The existence of this petition became known due to the assistance provided by the Soviet Counterintelligence Service in 1943, when they captured the Unearthed research group, which was abandoned by the German command deep behind enemy lines and had become interested in an artifact that had since vanished without a trace. Nevertheless, there was something that caused Major Kurikov to question his decision to assign Nilyubin to investigate this mysterious case: Semyon's growing doubts about his experience in the taiga. Semyon began to recall less and less about his time in the wilderness, which at times seemed vivid but also felt like a dream. The city, with its smog-filled air, seemed to bring oblivion, convincing him that there was nothing worth remembering beyond its smelly concrete walls. Upon returning to his hometown, however, the fog cleared, revealing a forgotten life experience. Bakhtiarov noticed Semyon's transformation
and asked how he learned about Itarma. Semyon paused for a moment in silence, uncertain whether it was fitting to impart a fragment of his personal narrative to a stranger. Following a brief interval of introspection, during which his interlocutor had already resigned to the lack of response, Semyon resolved that it might be worthwhile. Indeed, Bakhtiarov appeared genuinely intrigued by the culture of the Manti people, and Semyon's tale could potentially enrich Bakhtiarov's understanding, a gift Semyon was pleased to bestow. "I once resided in those regions," the committee member commenced, capturing Bakhtiarov's astonished gaze, "and I was acquainted with the hunter who crafted itars for the deceased. This skill in itself was not particularly extraordinary, for almost everyone in my village possessed the ability to fashion a container for the spirit from a piece of wood. However, it was Nyado who imbued his dolls with a terrifyingly lifelike appearance. Semyon did not disclose that within the hollowed wooden forms crafted by Nyado, there existed channels filled with water and lingonberry sap, which the hunter vehemently denied, claiming they were real blood, resulting from the merging of the soul with the meticulously crafted vessel.
There is even a legend, Simeon went on, as if lost in his thoughts, speaking aloud and erasing the dust of memories from the corners of his mind, that his hands were guided by none other than the malevolent Kul Otir himself, to whom Nyaroch ventured to his lair during one of his hunts. It is said that instead of losing his life, Nyaroch bargained with the Lord of the Underworld for the skills that have always drawn him, offering to serve Kulotir's dark schemes on Earth in exchange. I am certain of one thing. Nyaroch would not consort with anyone from the stone trap, as he referred to the city. Thus, I immediately realized that you were not obtaining such high-quality medications from him. Doubtless, he is no longer alive, having lived to be around 105, although as a child, my parents told me that followers of Kulotir could live far longer than ordinary mortals, but rather from the stone log, the burial ground for the inhabitants of our village. You are correct, Bakhtiarov conceded, after a brief silence when Semyon fell silent. It is not right to perpetuate the culture of minor ethnic groups by plundering ritual objects from the graves of recently deceased individuals. At long last, the companions came to the entrance of the park, where they found only the guard on duty. The rest of the staff and the police detective had been ordered by their superior to keep everyone out until the investigation was over. Bakhtiarov, irritated by the old man who had appeared not to have noticed their arrival, rapped loudly on the door of the gatehouse. "Do you possess a key to this door?" inquired Simeon of the scientist. The scientist, perplexed, produced a set of keys from his pocket and murmured, "Indeed, yes. But where could this elderly man have gone?"
Upon unlocking the door, Niluban directed Bakhtiarov to remain outside and refrain from entering the guardhouse without authorization. He undid the buttons on his coat, devoid of any insignia, and, disregarding Bakhtiarov's astonished exclamation, extracted his Makarov pistol from its holster, taking care to ensure its safety as he crossed the threshold. The small, chilly room was in a state of disarray, furnished with Spartan austerity. The narrow cot, designed for a side sleeper, was unmade, and dirty dishes cluttered the table next to a square window that allowed only a sliver of sunlight to penetrate. It was clear that the person who had occupied the space recently had hastily finished their meal and departed in haste. More ashes had accumulated in the hearth of the cast iron stove, still emanating a faint warmth. From outside, Bakhtiarov's impatient voice echoed. "I'll inform you as soon as I have any news," Simeon replied, irritated by the interruption. He slammed the door shut and slid the lock home. Upon initial inspection, there appeared to be nothing out of the ordinary within the confines of the room, Yet the committee member proceeded to meticulously scrutinize every nook and cranny in the hope of uncovering a concealed location that might provide insight into the enigmatic events unfolding within the space. Having conducted a thorough search, he proceeded towards the door, ready to allow Bakhtiadov entry, who stood impatiently awaiting. However, just as he took a step forward, he suddenly clapped his hand against his forehead, as though he had suddenly recalled something he had overlooked. Resuming his work at the hearth, Semyon unlocked the door and, with deliberate care, employed a poker from an iron-forged stand to agitate the embers and partially unconsumed logs which had failed to fully ignite due to inadequate combustion. Almost instantaneously, he discovered what he sought: a singed notebook bound in thick leather, adorned with a scarlet star on its cover.
Having swiftly perused the pages, which predominantly comprised mundane entries detailing everyday occurrences, addresses of various establishments, and the park keeper's musings on the future of the locale, which in Nilubin's estimation appeared rather somber, he finally reached the conclusion of the tome, where he uncovered a clue that might elucidate the fate of the vanished tourists. "Today I met the Seer" was inscribed in large letters, and the words were underscored multiple times on the page. Tapan regarded this as a momentous event, and it was followed by a series of tasks that Tapan was required to complete on specific days. The instructions were written in a concise script and in a form of the Mansi language that would be difficult to decipher if it fell into unfriendly hands. Despite the fact that Nilubin spoke a variant of the language in his native village that was more widely spoken and studied by scholars, he still found the text challenging to comprehend. However, due to the presence of familiar words in both Nilubin's and Tapan's dialects, and his familiarity with the events, Nilubin was able to make sense of the text. Semyon pondered, struggling to make sense of the convoluted array of words before him. One thing is certain: someone, masquerading as a seer, is manipulating Tapan, exploiting his credulity. Tapan eagerly follows their instructions, even if it involves harming people in the park. But what is their ultimate goal? Could it be to deter potential visitors from entering the park? We must follow Tapan to find out. Semyon, with his shamanic background, knew that the seer, who always concealed his face behind a cedar mask, was revered by many in his tribe as a demigod capable of deciphering the omens of the future left by Shigir, the powerful idol now vanished from Viper Lake. Every few years, the seer would visit a village and select a vanakum, an assistant, and no one could refuse this honor, even though serving the seer brought swift aging and death due to the burden of knowledge imparted by Shigir.
Semyon's conviction that an impostor was concealed behind the guise of the seer was not unfounded. Years earlier, he had witnessed with his own eyes the figure clad in bearskin being shot by a member of the Ananerbe team. As soon as Semyon emerged from the gatehouse, he addressed Bakhtiadov with a query. "Is he there? Is he still alive?" he inquired. With a grin and a shrug, Semyon replied, "Your watchman is no more. He was afraid of what transpired in the park and did not wish to draw undue attention from the authorities. Find a new one if you must." Confused Bakhtiadov murmured, "This is not satisfactory. What shall we do now?" Determinedly, Semyon took a path barely discernible, leading through the territory of Horian Pavel. "I am going for a walk," he stated, his tone dry in response to Bakhtiadov's inquiry about his investigation. "You may seek a new watchman," he added, before disappearing into the taiga. It was perhaps the first time in years that Nelyubin experienced genuine fear. Far removed from the dark, damp basements of an abandoned structure where he once searched for an insane individual or a crowded barracks, the nocturnal taiga and its denizens presented a far more alarming presence. For nearly half an hour, Semyon remained concealed in a crevice between a boulder and the frozen soil, as a recently aroused bear prowled nearby, its hunger evident.
In his predicament, the committee member berated himself repeatedly for venturing alone into Mokovi Ravine in pursuit of Tapon, whom, based on the notes in his journal, he believed had also ventured there. With the sun descending below the horizon, darkness descended upon the forest, accompanied by a cacophony of rustles, creaks, and the calls of nocturnal birds.
At first, Semyon had even considered darkness to be advantageous. His keen eyes allowed him to discern the path clearly, and there was nothing to prevent him from stepping aside or concealing himself among the underbrush should he detect anything suspicious. However, upon hearing a human groan of agony interspersed with bestial growls that sent a chill down his spine, Semyon bitterly regretted not having brought Kudyakov and Dybenko along. He had viewed them as a liability, but now he understood their value. As the dark form, emitting unsettling sounds, emerged onto the trail, Semyon froze in confusion. He recognized that the most prudent course of action in avoiding the bear, evidently experiencing vocal difficulties, would be to seek refuge in a secluded location, rather than attempt to intimidate it with his service weapon. Nelyabin, stealthily endeavoring to evade detection, began to move away at a rapid pace, navigating through the dense branches. The creature, its heavy breathing growing nearer, had detected the intruder's presence. In a final attempt to escape, Semyon drew his pistol, determined to protect himself. He was well aware that with such a feeble weapon, his chances of survival were slim. Suddenly, his gaze fell on a rock, slightly taller than the surrounding pines, with a rounded arch at its center. Underneath the rock, natural forces had caused a boulder to break off and fall, creating a narrow opening. Nelyabin swiftly rolled beneath the arch, offering a narrow passage just large enough for a human to squeeze through, but not for the bear's claws to reach. He offered silent gratitude to the supernatural forces that had provided him with this escape route. The initial relief swiftly gave way to unease as the temperature plummeted during the night, and the bed of cold earth and stone provided little warmth. The bear remained, guarding its prey, prowling back and forth, occasionally emitting sounds akin to low grumbles. Semyon, after a period of waiting, decided to attempt to frighten the predator away until it became completely immobilized. With hands that had grown numb, he drew a pistol from its holster and cautiously peered out from beneath the rock, taking aim at the bear. However, with surprising dexterity for such a massive creature, the bear darted to one side, having detected the threat posed by the weapon. Experienced, mused Semyon with a touch of exasperation, he will likely shadow me until the day I die. My only hope lies in Bakhtyrov becoming suspicious and sending someone after me. Trembling from the chill, Nelyabin huddled as best he could within the cramped shelter, attempting to maintain warmth. He acknowledged that none of the strategies employed by city dwellers to ward off the master of the forest in the event of a confrontation would prove effective for him. And even if they had been successful in more auspicious circumstances, they were likely to prove futile in his current predicament. In a state of desperation, Semyon delved into his memory, seeking techniques employed by the Mansi to repel bears. Images from his childhood instantly appeared before his inner eye, as if his memories had been waiting for him to unlock the door to a hidden closet. He vividly recalled people wearing birch bark masks, dancing around a campfire, attempting to appease the spirit of a bear they had recently slain. The vision dissolved, replaced by the sight of two hunters hanging bundles of rosemary, hoping to ward off a clubfoot who owned the land they sought to hunt upon. Semyon became aware that he no longer felt the chill and desired to continue moving in order to maintain his warmth, yet a wave of drowsiness overtook him, erasing all thoughts of his existence. It was as if Semyon had been transported back in time 17 years, reverting to his teenage self. He and the other 12-year-olds were gathered on a steep hill adjacent to the Serpentine River, which coursed directly behind Pavel and flowed out of the Viper's mist. Among his companions, Sauter overheard one of the boys beside him requesting Numetorum, the soothsayer who navigated the Serpentine on a dugout canoe, to select him as his apprentice. The majority of the other youths, including Sauter, stood in silence, uncertainly gazing at the individual in the nettle-hulled boat, whose countenance was concealed behind a cedar bark mask with eye and nasal openings. Sauter had heard from elders that the figure of the seer was revered by the tribesmen alongside the lesser deities and was believed to be endowed with divine powers. According to myth, a shaman dwelling in the forest could foresee the future with the aid of a 3-meter-tall larch idol known as a shigyur. Thanks to his prophecies, the people of the forest were able to anticipate impending dangers and either relocate to new locations away from overflowing rivers, take refuge under rocks to evade detection by bloodthirsty outsiders, or dig broad trenches to prevent forest fires. His instructions were followed without question, and it was regarded as a great honor to be chosen to assist him. To be chosen to aid the seer was considered an extraordinary honor. Families whose members irreversibly ventured into the thicket to assist the seer were accorded respect and esteem in the village. The neighbors presented gifts to the families who had departed for the forest on a monthly basis. However, the landscape has shifted. The forest dwellers are now increasingly encountering the mainland. Some have chosen to reside in concrete structures, while others have enlisted in the fight against Nazi Germany. Consequently, confidence in the prophet is waning, sustained solely by the influence of the elders.
Upon Shakul's return to Pavli after serving in the military, he challenged the young Mansi's faith in the prophetic visions of Soter, Shakul's cousin. Shakul embarked on his journey to Pavli following the Serpentine route a few days prior to the arrival of the shaman. Accompanying him were 2 taciturn comrades in arms who, like him, had distinguished themselves on the front lines. The veteran recounted many tales, detailing the relentless battles and atrocities perpetrated by the German forces, as well as the devastating explosions of shells overhead. However, what truly captivated Shakul's audience were his descriptions of the grandeur of the cities, which, despite being subjected to relentless bombardment, remained unyielding in their splendor. He was increasingly convinced that these concrete edifices were the creations of a master sculptor, and he implored his brother to continue sharing stories of tall, magnificent structures that once enchanted those accustomed to dwelling in humble huts. He spoke of churches adorned with gilded crosses where people sought solace and offered prayers for victory. He also spoke of wide bridges that spanned turbulent rivers connecting disparate shores. Shakul, during what was ostensibly his vacation, often departed with his companions, leaving no trail of his whereabouts. In response to perplexed inquiries, he offered vague responses about his intention to show his companions around. However, based on the state of his worn-out shoes, soiled garments, and fatigued countenances after yet another excursion through the woods, Soter deduced that the vacationers had traversed through urban slums, an area not readily visited by even the most adventurous Mansi.
Upon the seer's departure, Shakul once again set out with his companions. Having witnessed the vastness of the world, he would have challenged the prevailing beliefs, yet no one defended Soter as the seer, with his gnarled finger, singled him out as the chosen one. "Is life so difficult for you?" a wizened voice murmured with a hint of sarcasm nearby. "I could have stayed by the hearth in my humble abode, but no, I opted for the rugged path." In response to the menacing growl, the elderly woman angrily exclaimed, "Oh, are you still going to be so insolent?" She menaced, "Get out of here, or I shall fashion a hat from your veins."
Simeon, having been immersed in a tranquil slumber, was suddenly awoken by the peculiar exchange. He became aware that he had been abruptly transported from the comfort of his slumber to a cold and stiff position on the ground. With a sense of lethargy, he understood that he would likely perish if he remained in a state of sleep. Irregardless of his apathy, Nelubin was aware that he only possessed a limited amount of time remaining. He knew that he must make a choice, either flee or face certain demise. With immense effort, he mustered the remnants of his strength and crawled out from underneath the boulder, clutching the pistol before him. It now appeared to him like a feeble toy. At any moment, he anticipated a mortal blow from the beast's claws. Slowly, Simeon surveyed his surroundings, anticipating the creature's attack at any instant. The clearing before the frost-encrusted rocks appeared deserted, as if the beast had heeded a warning from an enigmatic old woman. As he glanced back at the outcropping of rock that had impeded his path, he discerned the flickering reflections of flames in the depths of a sunken cavern, which had eluded his notice during his panicked flight from the bear.
As Semyon approached the grotto with rapt attention, a faint rustling sound emanated from above. Rather than succumbing to the allure of curiosity, which can prove fatal for humans in such situations, he endeavored to discern the source of the noise within the ring-like archway. The sound resembled the scratching of claws against stone. Trusting his instinct for self-preservation, honed through centuries of experience, Semyon swiftly darted aside as the bear leapt from its concealed position atop the rock. The bear, having landed 3 stories below on a hard surface rather than a yielding human form, emitted a pained growl as it struggled to regain its footing. Semyon promptly unleashed the entire contents of his ammunition magazine at the shaggy predator, each bullet eliciting a violent shudder from the bear. "You are fortunate that his skin has not yet been damaged," the elderly woman remarked with a sly grin as she emerged from the cavern in response to Semyon's arrival. "Otherwise, your effigy would have been of no use to you. Well, come in and warm yourself. Let this creature remain here. I will fashion a hat from its hide for the coming winter." Still reeling from the encounter with the creature, Semyon followed the woman into the depths of the cave. Despite his astonishment, he could not help but notice the peculiar nature of her attire. A garment resembling a raspberry, a shawl draped across her shoulders, and wide trousers tucked into high-top boots made of thick, fibrous threads that bore traces of age-induced yellowing. The inhabitant of this subterranean realm did not rely on skins, furs, or fabrics for their garments. She gestured for Semyon to sit by the campfire on a warm stone where a pungent brew simmered in a rusted pot. She herself sat on a bench and resumed her task, which had been interrupted by Semyon's entrance, sewing. "Do not concern yourself with the aroma," she quipped, revealing her edentulous gums as she agitated the concoction with a wooden utensil. "The bouquet may not be enticing, but upon tasting it, you shall be enamored." "Thank you," replied Nelubin, attempting to suppress a rising sense of nausea. "I shall rest for a moment and then resume my journey." The elderly woman responded with a sly smile. "Well, what was your destination at such an ungodly hour? Do you not know that there is life in the woodland at night, and that a stranger is rarely welcome?" Semyon explained that he was on his way to Mojave Ravine when he encountered a bear. Stretching his hands towards the fire, he asked the woman for guidance on how to return to his destination, explaining that he had lost his sense of direction while fleeing in the darkness. Taken aback by the encounter, the stranger asked, "You seriously considered leaping into the ravine to evade the bear? What compels you to lead such a solitary existence?" At these words, a memory stirred in Semyon's mind. He recalled a time when he lay beside a crackling fire, and in the adjoining room, his father, believing his youngest son to be asleep, spoke to his mother about Porun. Porun had accidentally fallen into a moss-covered ravine after imbibing fly agaric concoctions, much to their dismay. "We must set bear traps around Pavel. God forbid he returns in his new guise," his father lamented. Deep in thought, Semyon responded to the elderly woman awaiting an answer, realizing that it would be futile to venture into the moss-shrouded ravine. After all, Tapon lay lifeless at the mouth of the cave. "Might I inquire if you have encountered a 19-year-old red-haired lad in the vicinity?" he asked, describing Petya Vasilyev's appearance. "I have seen it, certainly. It is on the shore of the Viper Mist, where a three-forked pine tree flourishes." The response came after a moment of silence. "I shall tell you more. As the buds on the trees begin to swell, I shall commence the process of sewing a summer dress from it. The yarn has been prepared already." The elderly woman gestured towards the far wall of the cavern, where two large spinning wheels stood, each with the strange whitish thread from which her garments were crafted. Semyon murmured, "Spinning wheels. Is that what you call them?" The witch agreed, nodding and licking her lips. "If you know my name, you know what lies in store for you." Nilyubin whispered, "I was often frightened of you when I was a child. Many of us were. We left offerings in your chambers, but all we needed to do was to take you to an asylum. It is all right. Once I complete this task, I will see to it that you are taken care of." "You must have grown quite rigid in your life in this concrete world," remarked the elderly woman with a sardonic smile. At this moment, the shadows she cast upon the wall began to take on a distinct shape, expanding in size and acquiring horns. Within seconds, the entire surface was dominated by the imposing silhouette of a monstrous horned creature. The witch continued her discourse, observing the bewildered reaction of Semyon, who shifted his gaze from her to the wall. "I have forgotten many things about this place, Taiga. However, there are universal laws that apply here." Nilyubin, recovering his composure, broke free from the eerie shadow and pointed his gun menacingly at her. "One of these laws has already come into effect. If you do not wish to share his fate, best tell me where to find an equally eccentric old soul like yourself who sees things that are not there."
"Ah, it is you," the sorceress surmised as the shadowy form behind her abruptly shrank, revealing the familiar silhouette of an aged woman who had been confined to the earth for many years. "The entire Taiga buzzes with tales of you. Very well, be it as it may. I shall not twist your fate upon the spindle." Weary of the tumultuous whirlpool of events, Nilyubin repeated his inquiry. "Where is he?" Tanwarp Ekwa responded matter-of-factly. "You shall find him beside the one who will fit me into the sundress." She began to draw a trail on the sooty wall, leading towards the lake. "To the very place where you once betrayed your fate. I regret the loss of this thread, yet how can I refuse the messengers of the gods?" She mused, her eyes following Semyon as he departed from the cave.
Semyon stood on the southern bank of the Viper Mist, a solitary patch of land that lay beyond the confines of the ancient forest, its dense canopy interwoven with the tenacious clutches of thorny shrubs. The lake, freed from its icy bonds, revealed its frosty expanse, marked by wide channels and a faint haze, a familiar presence in this enigmatic place, appearing at any season and under any weather conditions. Behind Semyon, the pine trees swayed menacingly in the wake of a fierce gust of wind that descended from the heights of the Laughing Mountains, akin to its neighboring kin. And before him lay the decaying form of Petka Vasilyev, his head shattered, with neat punctures in his limbs from which the tan-warp Ekwa, dwelling in the rocky recesses, had extracted the veins to fashion a sundress for herself. Semyon, upon his arrival, appeared to have been transported back in time. The wooden statue, still standing on the tranquil beach, seemed about to speak in a thunderous voice, while Onanurb agents dressed in unassuming attire emerged from behind the trees. These agents, identifiable only by their subtle accents and cruel gazes, were searching for any signs of threat.
As Nalubin approached the 3-meter-tall statue, crafted from a split log of dense, larch timber, intricately adorned with primitive designs, he could not help but shudder. The carving of the face on the convex oval top, executed by a mysterious artist, to Nalubin appeared, in the dim light of the rising sun, as if Shagir's face had been distorted into an enraged grimace at the approach of the committee member. Upon observing the branches that lay at the base of the idol, Semyon swiftly grasped the reason behind the disappearance of Bakteriov's display, even though the exhibit had not physically relocated. The Shagir idol had been concealed beneath the paws of Menkva, rendering it invisible to the prying eyes of observers. Semyon initially considered the possibility that the idol had simply been blown away by the wind, dismissing the notion that someone may have deliberately concealed it to draw his attention. However, beneath a small breach in the idol's surface, clumsily sealed with mastic, the team from the Iset Museum discovered a bone figurine during their investigations. This artifact appeared significantly more recent than the other objects, and upon closer examination, Semyon recognized familiar motifs. 3 figures beside a sled, a person leaping into a chasm and transforming into a bear, and 2 individuals conversing near a campfire. On a whim, he ran his hand over the crude drawings, pondering if they were left behind by the individual who had been feigning. Was he truly feigning? The thought flitted through Semyon's mind. The Seer. The moment he withdrew his hand, sunlight flooded the space. The remnants of snow, still unmelted under the warmth of spring, vanished, revealing verdant grass. The mist of the Viper softly rustled, rolling onto the shore in gentle waves in the summer breeze. A soft voice inquired behind him, "Well, what did you perceive?"
Semyon pivoted to see a shaman standing before him, clad in a canvas hoodie adorned with squirrel tails dangling from the sleeves, their faces concealed beneath a cedar mask. "I saw," Semyon replied in a childlike voice, "that the river will overflow its banks following autumn rains." Another vision, he realized. "Did you not see anything else?" the seer queried Sotra, piercing him with his vivid blue eyes. Sotra responded, "No, nothing of significance." The shaman gave a curt nod. "Very well. Go within and rest." Sotra hastily inclined his head in assent and made his way to a modest hut nestled near the trident-like pine tree, where he had taken refuge for 2 weeks. Sleepless nights had been spent on a makeshift couch of fir boughs as he sought to evade the clutches of the viper mist. Repeatedly, the forest appeared to draw him back to the shore, where the Shigir and the Seer awaited, shaking their heads in resignation and cautioning him against defying fate. On this day, Sotra perceived a shift. The shaman offered him a glimpse into the future through the touch of an idol. Were the visions he beheld to materialize, he might yet find his escape. Sotra observed the Seer through one of the numerous crevices in the hut, precisely at the moment when 3 hulking men, attired in dark shirts and pants with tattered fabric and muddy canvas boots, disembarked. At first sight, they appeared to be unremarkable Soviet citizens who had become lost in the Taiga. However, upon the muffled report of a firearm resounding across the shore, and as the Seer crumpled to the ground in a limp heap, accompanied by terse German phrases, Sotra comprehended that these individuals were the cause behind Shakul's arrival and that of his comrades who had come on holiday to conduct a search of the countryside.
Escaping from the hut, he hastened towards the snake line, intending to ford the river and reach his pavilion. However, the ruse devised by the Seer proved futile, and he soon found himself by the riverbank, where a boat concealed in the dense coastal undergrowth awaited him, filled with the belongings of the saboteurs. As he prepared to push the boat into the water and make his escape, a rifle barrel pressed against his back, freezing him in place. "Do not move," a voice growled, and Shakul's name echoed in Soter's mind. It was Shakul himself. Soter nearly cried out in relief. Confusion evident in his voice, Shakul exclaimed, "We nearly shot you. We thought the Germans had returned." His companions, having been safely concealed among the reeds, approached him. Soter exclaimed with urgency, "I know their location. They are near the Viper Fog." Shakul abruptly commanded, "Let's go, but do not go ahead of me. Unearthed agents are skilled fighters." What could they possibly seek in this wilderness? According to the information at our disposal, under Hitler's orders, they are actively seeking for something that might reveal the Führer's prospects of success. It seems that this statue is the target, as stated by a blonde-haired officer of counterintelligence named Kurakov, who stood beside me. Upon hearing these words, a series of events began to play out in Semyon's mind, plunging him into a state akin to trance. The vision of the Germans captured by counterintelligence officers, sawing several large sections off the statue, gave way to a flashback to Isetsk 5 years after the war. This was followed by a fateful encounter on Rail Street, where Semyon encountered Captain Kurakov, head of the investigation department of the KGB, who readily agreed to hire him. "Well, Vanyenhum, have you remembered your past life?" A soft voice interrupted the kaleidoscope of recollections from behind.
Semyon whirled about, almost collapsing from the disorienting effect of his sudden return to the world. Before him stood a massive figure, clad in furs, brandishing a club of oak, measuring nearly 2.5 feet in length, more akin to a bludgeon than a traditional herding tool. "Who are you?" Semyon croaked, his gaze fixed on the blue eyes gleaming through the slits of a cedar mask similar to those he had witnessed 17 years earlier in this very place. The figure responded, "You know." "I do not," Nelyinbin retorted. "The one you're hiding behind has been deceased for many years, slain by a German round." The shaman smirked. "You cannot so easily extinguish me. I am not human. I am merely an embodiment of Shigir." "You cannot so easily extinguish me? I am not human.
I am merely an embodiment of Shigir." Semyon interjected. "Why did you murder that student? Was it merely to bring me here?" "I did not wish for his demise," the shaman said, taking a few steps towards the council member. "But Tonwarp Equa would not consent to assist me without her own quid pro quo. And in order for the version of the future in which you exist to materialize, your encounter with her and Tapan's transformation into a grouch were necessary. Had these events not transpired, I might have lost a valuable opportunity for retribution." "Enough of this talk," Simeon said, drawing a pistol with a fresh magazine. "You are merely a madman. Discard the staff in your hand and approach Harin Pavil before me. Do not run, for the bullet will strike you instantly." Rather than complying with the demands of the official, the shaman menacingly advanced towards him, brandishing the staff. As Nelyubin retreated, he soon found himself confronted with the edge of a lake, its surface covered in thin ice. Near the shore, the icy expanse was particularly treacherous, riddled with wide fissures filled with black, chillingly cold water.
As the shaman continued his approach in a peculiar dance, Semyon let off a warning shot in the air. Realizing that it had no effect, he adjusted his aim to target the seer's legs. The shaman, undeterred, let out a hearty laugh. "So, this is how you intend to stop an immortal being," he taunted. "Your scarecrow will not be enough." He then charged forward with renewed vigor. Taken aback, Semyon stumbled backward by inertia, tripping over a rock and falling backward into the brush. Instinctively, he raised his arm with the gun, protecting himself from the impending impact. Fortunately, the depth of the lake was shallow, preventing Semyon from drowning. However, the frigid water caused him to feel as if a hoop were constricting his chest, momentarily impairing his ability to breathe. Just as Semyon regained his footing, the staff collapsed where his head had just been, shattering the edge of the ice and sending a spray of water in all directions. Semyon was not one to take unnecessary chances in a fight that could prove fatal for either combatant. Thus, he aimed at the shaman's chest. When the shaman stumbled and began to swing his weapon once more, Semyon unleashed 2 more rounds at him. Slowly, the seer's pale eyes, visible through the slits of his mask, closed as he collapsed to the ground, his weapon falling from his grasp. Upon reaching the shore, Semyon approached the motionless form clad in animal skins with caution. He dismissed the temptation of donning the deceased man's dried clothing and resolved to make haste for Korin Pavel. There, assistance could be sought and a team of investigators could be dispatched to the site. Semyon, splashing cold water onto his canvas boots, set off along a broad path marked with decorations on the trees. These decorations, it seemed, had been created by the staff of the ethnographic park. Despite his brisk pace, Semyon started to feel the cold. A thin layer of ice had formed on the back of his coat. In order to prevent complete freezing in the heart of the taiga, the commissar resorted to a brisk jog. Soon the forest became less dense, and the buildings of Korin Pavel emerged, shrouded in a misty haze, providing him with hope for swift rescue. With renewed vigor, the exhausted commissar pushed forward, his chest heaving with labored breaths. Finally, he surmounted the final stretch of path and sprinted straight to the bank of Viper Mist. Surveying his surroundings in amazement, Semyon realized that he once again found himself beside a statue adorned with intricate carvings. The squat structures he had mistaken for park yurts proved to be nothing more than clouds of mist, forming deceptive illusions under the influence of an unknown force. A Morok, Semyon mused. Somehow, the shaman's influence persists, even in death. But he ought to have been gone for years. Semyon shivered uncontrollably, but there was no way to start a fire, as his lighter and matches had become damp. Although in the days when he lived among the forest people, he would have known how to start a fire with improvised materials. He was prepared to wrap himself in the skin of a deceased individual, but upon looking around, he could not find the body of the soothsayer. This is it, Semyon realized as he sat helplessly on the ground, feeling a deceitful warmth begin to envelop his body, accompanied by a wave of drowsiness. From somewhere nearby, a hoarse voice spoke. We need to remove the stone from his chest and shatter it. Semyon, on the verge of sleep, suddenly opened his eyes to see Petka Vasilyev a few paces away, snow-covered, his vision hazy as he gazed at the stone. The deceased attempted to raise his arm to point at the object, but his limbs, bereft of tendons, merely twitched feebly. With a faint smile, Petka said, "You have it." His lips tinged with black.
A fleeting thought crossed Semyon's mind at these words, recalling the tragic fate of young and impetuous Kilim. In his quest for divine power, he had broken the bone swallows embedded in the wooden form of Shigir that stood atop Puramunitur, but the consequences were dire. Returning to Pavel as an old man with graying beard, he spoke to himself constantly, barely noticing those around him. Over time, he turned to drinking fly agaric concoctions, believing they could silence the second voice in his head. Eventually, his body succumbed to the poisonous brew, and he died in agony. Peter, seemingly reading Semyon's thoughts, asked, "Is it a voice in your mind, or just the cold breath of death?" It was a haunting question, one that carried the weight of a difficult choice. Nelyubin made his way to Shigir with slow, labored movements, leaning heavily on the ladder as he struggled to stand on his shaky legs. With each step, he stumbled, his unsteadiness causing him to strike the fragile mastic several times with the butt of his gun. Finally, he reached out, his hand plunging into the opening, and retrieved a small figurine in the shape of a swallow. It wasn't there, he declared, closing his eyes tightly and breaking the delicate object in half. Bakhtiriov inquired, "So Shigir remains standing?" Semyon nodded in affirmation, his body trembling from the chilling cold that had penetrated his very bones. Despite the warmth of the blanket, the steaming cup of tea clutched in his hands, and the crackling fire in the hearth of the house where he had finally sought refuge, he still could not shake off the chill. The frostbite on his feet had not yet fully subsided, and his lungs continued to feel severely chilled. However, as he attempted to navigate his way through the park, the cold failed to register in his consciousness. Instead, an insidious, alien presence had taken up residence in his mind, dulling his perceptions with its haunting narrative.
It is indeed regrettable that such an incident has occurred, mused Bakhtiyarov. After all, there has been a deranged killer living right next door to me all this time. What could have driven him to commit such a heinous act? The mind of another person is like a dark forest, said Semyon, spreading his arms. I have not encountered such cases in my line of work. However, there is nothing mysterious about Tepin's actions. He has gone mad. He believed that a shaman had ordered him to do something to the students, and even wrote about his delusional thoughts in his journal. Somehow, he managed to unearth the idol, move it away, and when he thought that you had lost track of it and would not look for it there, bring it back and commit the ritual murder. His disconnection from reality was so profound that he even assaulted me wearing a bear's pelt.
This is preposterous, muttered Bakhtiyarov. Wait a moment, he exclaimed. From what I've gathered from conversations with the local police, it seems that Tepin had an accomplice. Semyon responded with certainty. There was no accomplice. Ivanova, the frightened and confused student, misconstrued events, and the subsequent trauma completely unhinged her mind. Bakhtiyarov nodded his head, no longer preoccupied with Tepin's alleged accomplice, for the notebook discovered in his cabin revealed his madness. Rather, he was concerned about the criminal atmosphere now pervading the park. In Semyon's mind, a voice spoke. I cannot wait to depart from this place as soon as I can. I committed these heinous acts because they were the only means to bring about a future where I would possess a new body capable of holding two souls simultaneously, but they repulse my very nature. You do not understand. You may observe my life, but you dare not interfere.
I concur, replied a voice, akin to that emanating from beneath the cedar mask. I have been ensconced within this wooden form for so long that I would agree to any terms. Yet I may offer counsel at times, if you do not object. No more, replied Semyon. What did you say? Bakhtiyarov swiveled about. Nothing. Yes, the scientist responded, perplexed. The investigative team has arrived. He gestured outside the window towards the courtyard. After donning a dry coat, Semyon made his way to the exit, where he would meet with the team led by Khudyakov. He had pondered the narrative several times, which he had outlined for Bakhtiyarov, and now he was prepared to present it to the police, confident they would accept it without question. However, even if they posed queries he had not anticipated, he was certain that another voice within his head would not abandon him to his destiny. For after all, the proprietor of that voice knew far more about the taiga and its ways.